Hi, thanks for joining me. I am, unlike the previous people here, not a professional in this, but I do this a lot, and then I get really opinionated about what makes good or, unfortunately, bad technical talks, or just talks in general. And given all these opinions, and given a Twitter and a Medium account, why wouldn't I push all this information out there to people who don't care? Then after a while, I thought, well, maybe it makes sense to actually boil some of this into a talk, because what is more meta than giving a talk about giving talks? So why me? Because I give a lot of these things. That is it. That is my full personal qualification for being here. I give a lot of tech talks. I have opinions. They're not necessarily correct. I'm going to tell you the things that work for me that you can consider and then dump. Why are you here? I assume this is like GDG organizers, right? I assume this is not just people filling out spreadsheets and time cards for these organizations, but actually giving talks and wanting the talks in your organizations to be better. So maybe if I can infuse you with some of my strong opinions, then you can push on those unreasonable demands onto the people in your groups and into your own talks, maybe, if they work for you. If they don't work for you, push them onto other people. That'd be fine. The talk is going to consist of 3 sections, just so you know. First of all, I'm going to give a really horrible talk. But I didn't really want to stop in line and say, now this is why this part is horrible. I think most of it is obvious, but I would like to belabor the point and go over that talk again and sort of talk about those things. And then we'll have finally a third section, which is longer than the rest, where there's just like random brainstorm thoughts that I had about what makes things in tech talks more or less effective. Ideally, we would have time for discussion. Realistically, I am keeping you from lunch. So we'll see when I stop. I'm happy to stick around if you do have questions, you want to talk about stuff. If you want to grab food and talk in here, I don't know what the format of this thing is. That would be great. Otherwise, let's go. Hello and welcome to J2XDB Technology Assessment, Development of Specifications in the Early 21st Century. I am, of course, Chet Haase. I'm Technical Architect, MSE LLQ. With the N Squared Corporation. It's a little bit about myself. I did get a bachelor's degree, Bachelor's of Arts in the Art of Math. I also got a master's degree in CS. I did have high school education. I have had a long career in programming. I have worked at many technology companies and on many software platforms. And I've spoken at many conferences. I don't currently have an outside interest. Which I think qualifies me to speak to a technical crowd perfectly. Here's the agenda, all of the things that we're going to cover today. First, we'll go over the title. Then I'd like to talk about myself a little bit. Then we're going to have the agenda. We're going to cover some deep and technical things in this talk. We'll have some charts and data to back up those ideas that I have. I will further have some explanations and then bring us starting conclusions. And if possible, we may have time for questions and answers. Section 1, in which many important things are covered, such as the development of the thesis. Now, I will not cover everything on this slide, but I expect everybody to study these slides deeply after this talk, including the footnotes at the bottom. Speaking of theses, back to the agenda. Now, for charts and data, here is some important data. I think you'll agree. And here's some other data. I think this is self-explanatory. Now, you'll see in this equation that n, of course, stands for the normal vector. L is the light vector. The square root sign stands for the square root, and 2 stands for 2. In this other equation, n, again, is the light vector, normal vector. L is the light vector. V is the view direction vector. The square is used to square the terms, and 0.5 is the numerator into which the rest is divided. Now, here's something else very complicated. It's important to put the detailed information into the bullets. You may forget what you were going to say. If you don't think you can memorize the script and might not have speaker notes, then you can always put all of the information in the bullets and read them verbatim to the audience. Verbatim. I'd encourage everybody to fill out the session survey. That's a quote by me. Finally, for the conclusion, I think it's important to have a call to action for everybody in the crowd because there's nothing more active than a group of engineers. Do stuff with technology, and there's a QR code. Finish the conclusion, on to Q&A, which I don't really feel like entertaining. All right, that sucked. Let's belabor the point a little bit, and let's talk about the other two sections. How do we make better talks? First of all, let's go over the first talk. Some obvious things. Oh my God, what a hellacious title. That is horrible. When I wrote the book with Romain years ago for Swing and Java 2D called Filthy Rich Clients, we were playing with the title, and publishers were starting to play with things. It was awesome. It was awesome to be able to do that. We had a playful title, and yet it fully described what we wanted to do. There was a book that came out 6 months later from the same publisher that was called something along the lines of Kicking Butt with EJB Spec 2.1. which was a horrible title. It was an example of publishers playing around, but not really doing it very well. It's nice to be informal, but you also need to actually have something that actually makes sense. Otherwise, just stick with the material. Tell people what you're going to tell them, and if possible, make it a little bit playful to draw them in, right? This draws nobody in. It pushes people away. It also uses acronyms there. Acronyms tend to suck. If you don't know what XDB is, maybe you're going to look at this talk and go, well, I shouldn't be there. Well, maybe it's a reasonable set of technologies that you should know more about. But if it's not an obvious acronym to everybody in the crowd, then don't use it without explaining it. Also, just too darn many words. Too many words. You don't really need your title up there. Nobody needs to know that you have a PhD, honestly. It's kind of a detractor for me when I see people call that out. That's lovely that you got that. That's your business, not actually mine. So just the important thing for them to take away, and this falls into the next slide as well, is they should know why you're qualified to give the talk. Don't belabor the point, right? Titles don't help with that. Everybody can get a degree from Trump University if they want. Did I say that? Am I being recorded? True, not anymore. Oh, that's too bad. But that's about all they need to know, right? Like if you don't happen to know that I'm in the Android UI Toolkit team and I'm about to give a talk on Android UI Toolkit team stuff, wouldn't it be nice if you knew that maybe I was one of those people that could speak to this topic? But then get on with it. You know, I'm so-and-so, this is the team that I work on, or this is the company that I work for. I work with these technologies, and then on with the talk. When organizers give you a template that has an about the speaker slide, my first thing to do is delete it. You can really address that information back on the title slide. Just tell them who you are and what you do and get on with it. Don't kill them with enough information that they really don't want to know anything more about you at all. Also, formality is really weird. Like in general, I try to have conversational talks, and this is one of those stylistic things that I am not formal. I don't like my talks to be formal. I tend to think that talks are more engaging if they are informal. I am a developer, you are a developer, we are talking about developer things. It doesn't have to be like I am the person at the podium with the microphone. Obviously, I'm more qualified than you, and you should address me formally as Mr. Haase. Like just push away the formality and just be a person in the room with everybody else there. Agenda. This can be helpful if you have a confusing agenda and you want people to understand the flow of the talk. It's not that horrible to at least say at the beginning, or maybe even have one agenda slide that sort of covers very briefly, hey, we're going to be talking about the reasons for this technology, and then we're going to show you some great examples for it. And then finally, we're going to see how it's being used in the real world. But other than that, like certainly going back to the agenda every time is too much information. But a lot of people sort of get this encoded like, I have to cover the agenda, I have to tell people what we're going to do, and then I have to do the thing, and then I have to tell them what we've done. Well, the important thing was to actually tell them the stuff, not spend too much time on the administration of how you're delivering that information. As long as it's an obvious flow, you probably don't need an agenda at all. And if it's not, then use a brief agenda, cover it quickly, get out of it. This one, way too much information on the slide. This is one of my things that I go back to over and over is the density of information on the slide. If you think about it, we have a single core in our system, right? In particular, we have a single core language processing unit, which means if somebody is talking to us and somebody else talks, we don't know what to do, right? We want to shut one of them up so that we can hear the other. The same thing is true, and you can choose which one you shut up. That's fine. It might be me. The same thing is true when you see words on the screen, right? If I'm talking and that comes up on the screen, there's nothing more exciting to a human brain than to see words that they can parse and try to understand, right? Put a box of cereal in front of me with ads on it, and I will read the ads because there's nothing else to look at in the room as interesting as the words on that box of cereal, right? So if I put this slide up, you're immediately going to go to the slide and you're going to start reading it and you're going to tune me out. Well, theoretically, I'm here to actually teach you this stuff. The slides aren't doing that job. Otherwise, I would have just written an article, right? So don't put all the information on the slides because then they're going to tune you out and be reading your slides. And in the meantime, they're not going to understand them very well because there's not enough information in the slides. And there's this idiot talking at the same time, right? And you certainly don't need things like footnotes down at the bottom, right? Way too much information, complete sentences, my God, complete paragraphs in there. Don't do it. I've seen slide templates created with this in mind. They have like a title up there, and then they have a small font in the middle where you're supposed to put your paragraph. Don't. Please don't. No, don't do that. So, too much stuff. Agenda, again, don't go back. Important data. Wouldn't it be nice if you actually understood what the graph was? Like, it's a nice, simple graph. You could have put enough information so that they understood what the graph was actually doing there. A lot of graphs with like not enough salient details for you to understand where you're going with this information. On the other hand, yeah, what are those units? On the other hand, way too many technical talks with like entirely too much technical information on the screen. Can't process that. There was a couple of things I was doing the equations that I've seen. One is there's a tendency for complicated things to be on the screen, and in some situations like this, that may be totally valid. Like, this is a really complicated thing, and maybe you need everybody to understand that this is the lighting equation for the renderer, that they need to understand, whatever, right? It's totally valid to have that there. There are better ways of either revealing that information progressively or explaining it so that they can actually understand the information. Two bad ways to go about that are you've memorized what it is, and none of us are actors, which means we're not going to memorize it very well. And then when we try to repeat it, we're going to look up into space, and then we're going to close the eyes because we're trying to remember what that line was that we were going to say, and then I was going to say that thing about N. And in the meantime, the audience has completely lost track of what you're talking about, right? So memorization, bad in general. It just does not work very well. And the other trick is to put it all in the speaker notes. And you are up there on stage, and there's a couple of hundred people in the audience, and you're super nervous, and you haven't given a lot of talks before, and you forget. What was I going to do on this slide? And you see, oh, good, there's speaker notes. And then you just start reading them. And it's horrible. I don't use speaker notes at all, or if I do, I will put 1, 2, maybe 3 words in the speaker notes. If it's anything more than that, then I can't get it quickly enough to keep myself in the flow. Because I am also a single core language processing unit. If I look down and there's a paragraph of information in the speaker notes, for me to understand that, I would have to stop speaking to you so that I could focus on reading that and understanding what it was I was supposed to say. So don't use speaker notes in general, and certainly don't depend on reading them. What I do with speaker notes, I actually do use them for sort of making notes as I go along, and if I leave those notes in there, I just ignore them. Maybe I needed that information, but it's too late now. I'd really rather keep engaged with the audience than to start reading the stuff that's in my notes. Something else very complicated. In general, don't read the bullets. Big problem. In general, people will put, okay, so the other alternative, instead of using speaker notes, and I do this, like bullets exist for one reason in my world. They are reminders to me of what I wanted to say. But they're not reminders of exactly what I wanted to say. I will put very brief information in bullets or in other information on the slide that reminds me what it was I wanted to talk about on that slide. I won't put the complete sentences because then you just end up reading the bullets. And everybody in the audience is going, he's reading the bullets. It's really horrible. You want to grab some lunch? All right. Useless slides with useless information. I always like the quotes, inspirational quotes in there. And calls to action. I love this too. Like, sometimes there's a call to action, but really I think it's kind of a marketing person thought out that concept. And then we're going to motivate them by telling them to go to the website. Okay, I think it's kind of obvious, but okay, sure. So make sure there's actually a reason for all the content, all the slides that you're putting up there. And I don't know, I just find QR codes funny. Who has an app that reads QR codes right now? I think my airline app does, and that's about it. Q&A is really good for engaging the audience. I'll get to this a little bit later. But one failure I've seen at conferences, I deal a lot with conference organizers. Chooky. If the organizer is in a different situation than some of the people in this room, where they don't actually give talks, then they have an idea in their head about how these talks should be given. And one of them is, okay, well, we have a 45-minute session, so speak for 30 minutes, stop, and then do Q&A for 15 minutes, which in my mind is a waste of at least 10 minutes. Because the questions that are being asked from the audience point of view are anecdotal questions from individual developers. Maybe some other people care about that topic, but the person who cares most about it is the person that answered the question. So that's lovely that you could answer those 8 people's questions, and in the meantime, you wasted 200 people's time, right? So I think Q&A is really good for engaging the room and showing that you are open, and if there are any really hot topics that spawn a discussion, that's fantastic, but cut it off. Like even if I stopped, like one of the talks that we're giving this week, I'm not sure that there's enough to go all the way up to whatever the time is at I/O, 40 minutes or whatever. Maybe we'll stop at half an hour, and then we'll do Q&A for 5 minutes, and then cut it off. You don't have to be there for the full time. You're not, paid on union wages to be there, right? Just go ahead and have a little bit of Q&A, interact with the crowd, and then say, okay, we'll take one more question. You take one more question, and that's it. Don't belabor the point. It's kind of tedious. Like you'll notice in a lot of talks, you get to the Q&A session and 2/3 of the room stands up and leaves because they know what's about to happen. Okay, now random tips, be in the room. This is one of the most important to me is like I am in the room with you now, right? When I'm in the room with the previous presenters. One of the tricks or techniques that I noticed myself doing, and I wasn't doing it intentionally, but I noticed that I just kept doing it over and over, was I would start any presentation not with, hello and welcome to this presentation. I'm Chet Haase from the Android UI Toolkit team. This one is going to be about blah, blah, blah. Instead, I would comment on something that was going on in the room. Something that somebody did, or the fact that I tripped on the stage coming to the podium, or something the previous presenters had done. So when I got here, I commented on the fact that the speechless folks were just here, and they know what they're doing, as opposed to me, I'm just making it up. But the nice thing about that was sort of twofold. One is I find it easier. There's always a lot of nervousness and fear in the system and adrenaline, like when you're first starting, like how do you get over that first 2 minutes? Well, it's way easier to have a conversation with the audience than it is to have a formal introduction to the audience, right? So it sort of allows me to ramp up into comfort mode up on stage. But at the same time, it allows me to then engage the audience and sort of tell everybody, hey, I'm actually in the room with you right now. I'm a person that happens to be standing here instead of sitting there, but otherwise we're all just developers in the room. So be in the room. If something happens in the room, somebody asks a question, somebody has a heart attack, whatever it is, like actually react to that stuff in the room instead of ignoring it and freaking out. And I understand nervousness is tricky, and the only way to get over that is with practice. But in the meantime, just know that actually being a part of the conversation in the room, I think, is one of the most important things in any presentation because it just makes it all more engaging. Speaking of engaging, the whole reason to do that, as well as some of these other techniques, is to engage the audience. I feel very strongly that you can't educate an audience if they're not paying attention, right? If they're asleep or they're on their laptop, then why are they going to remember anything that you're saying? Well, why am I wasting my time if they're not taking away information? So engage the audience in any way that you can. One of those ways is through humor. I love it when my presentations happen to be funny or something funny happens. In general, I do not script jokes into my technical presentations because you don't actually know if they're going to be funny. And then if you script a joke in there and it doesn't work, like, oh, then it's just awkward for everybody. It's embarrassing for the audience, and then the speaker is crying, and it's just a mess. But I do like it if I can make it engaging or entertaining or just sort of informally fun. Right, so when I'm giving presentations with Romain or anybody else and something comes up in my mind that I think would be fun for the audience to know, I will jump in with that because that's just part of this overall engaging conversation that we're having with the audience. So it's not like, no, this is Romain's slide, he's speaking to this content. Like, no, I have something that I think might be funny, and so you throw it out there. Having said that, if you're Not into funny, don't do funny. That can be worse if you're like trying to make jokes. The important thing is not to be funny, not to be making jokes in particular. The important thing is to actually be engaging with the audience in any way, right? And that's all about just being human, just being in the room and participating and being dynamic and not just being, nervous. I'm reading the speaker notes and I'm remembering my script and like, no. It's all going to be fine. We're all just having a conversation about this terribly interesting material. Being spontaneous, this relates, a lot of these things overlap, like be spontaneous, the comment that I made at the beginning, anything that happens in the room, something your co-speaker may have said, a question that somebody said, like actually work on being there and being able to react to things that go on in the room. And then that is further engagement points from the audience's point of view, right? This is further evidence that you're actually just part of this ongoing experience up there. Be real. One of my favorite things in presentations, and maybe we'll see this a bunch at a conference, I don't know, in the next few days, is when someone on stage says very woodenly, we're very excited to bring to you blah, 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 blah. And everything about their body language says they couldn't be less excited about this thing, right? But the marketing person said, this is a really exciting thing, tell the audience, and then they'll be excited. And so they say, we're really excited. And they're not. They're just not. And in addition to that, like maybe they actually are, but they're so nervous up on stage that it doesn't come across as very exciting. Then it doesn't come across as real. Then why would the audience believe anything else that you're saying? Right? So it's important to actually be real with the audience. It doesn't mean, we're not excited to bring you this thing. That's not the point at all. But just go on and tell them about the thing and tell them with the passion that you have for the product. Don't tell them that it is exciting. Show them with what you can do with the project, why it is, right? So actually be real. Don't use, the canned phrases that some, speech coach told you to use because this is going to bring people in. No, it won't. Actually, it'll push them away because nobody buys that when they hear it. Watch the tone. One of the things that I was doing in the earlier example was people tend to go monotone either from nervousness or maybe they're bored up there, or it certainly comes across as bored, or maybe they think it's important, like I need to come across as the authority, and so they come across instead as the arrogant authority, right? I think it's pretty important, like everything comes back to conversation. I am having a conversation with you. Everything I'm doing right now, like the volume and the energy is way amped up. You would think this was really weird if I was talking to you face to face, right? But it's amped up because that is the dynamic when you're giving a presentation. But everything else about what I'm saying is exactly the way that I would phrase it in sentences that I would use with you. And that includes the articulation of those sentences, right? So actually speak in normal sentences, articulate the same way that you would. Don't think, okay, well, this is a formal presentation and there are many people in the room and they need to know that I'm an authority on the subject and therefore I'm going to give this in a very authoritative manner. And you're going to bore everyone and they're going to go to sleep and they're not going to remember anything. I really enjoy having co-speakers. You may have noticed that, like most of the talks that I give, except today, because they wouldn't be here with me, are with co-speakers. I do it because it's fun. But I think it's fun, like I have more fun with a co-speaker if they're as comfortable as I am on stage in particular. If you get someone who's not comfortable on stage, then it's not as fun because I can't jump into the middle of what they're saying because I may throw them off. But you get someone else that's very comfortable up on stage and you can play off each other the entire time, right? Like I can think of something and jump in. I can forget something and the co-speaker can say, also, did you consider blah, blah, blah? Or I may think of an anecdote. This happened in one of the performance talks that we gave years ago at I.O. Romain was talking about something and I remembered something, some anecdote from when we were working on Honeycomb or whatever, and I said, oh, actually, and it makes it more fun and engaging for the audience because they can see that all of this is like real information that's coming at them in real time. The importance in having a co-speaker for me is that it makes everything more spontaneous because not only do I not know what I'm going to say, I have no idea what they're going to say, right? And the audience can see that. Maybe they see it because we're screwing up. But for me, it makes it a much more fun experience for the speaker, but I think also for the audience, just because there's more unpredictable improvisational stuff happening just by virtue of the fact that there are two people on stage having a conversation with each other as well as with you. However, don't have a co-speaker if they're not at the same comfort level as you and you can't figure out how to cleanly divide the talk, or if you feel like or if they feel like they want to, script the interaction back and forth. It can get super awkward up there if the speakers are like, okay, and now when I reach the end of this slide, I will say, okay, John, maybe you could show us a demo that illustrates this thing. Hey, Jane, that's a really good idea. Let me show you a demo about this. And the audience is going, most boring play ever, right? Have a co-speaker if you can be informal with them on stage, or if you can have very clear cut points and then have very real transitions. So one of the most common, and you will see this in most talks with co-speakers, is one speaker will end and they will say, okay, next up will be Chet to tell you about so-and-so. And then Chet walks on and he looks at the audience, he says, thanks, Jane. Talk to Jane, right? That's a very real interaction there, and you kind of blew it. I'm speaking to the audience because obviously I'm supposed to engage the audience, but I'm saying something that's to my co-speaker, right? Just think about the transitions. Don't have many of them, especially if it's someone that you're not familiar with going back and forth. Just make it very clear, like 1 or 2 cut points where you go back and forth, and then figure out how you're going to hand it off, or just do it cleanly. Chet's going to present the next section on so-and-so, and then you come on and you present the next section. Or you talk to Jane and you say, thanks, Jane, blah, 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 right? Just be real up there. Don't do, the canned scripted thing. And in particular, don't script jokes that go back and forth. That there's just worlds of hurt there when, like, neither one is a comedian, and then they're sort of carefully scripting this dialogue that it was really hilarious when they had a lot of beers the night before, but it didn't quite work. Come prepared. One of my trigger points in presentations is that you can tell nothing is scripted here, right? I've given this talk a couple of times before, but I have no idea what words and sentences and paragraphs I'm going to say on any particular slide because they're just ideas to me. Like, I know the idea of coming prepared. I know in general what I'm going to talk about, but I'm making up the words on the fly because I've been dealing with this language for a while, and I think we all kind of know what to do with that. Given the core idea, given the stuff that I've thought about, I can talk to that idea. So I don't script and I don't rehearse. Don't tell the organizers at I.O. But I do prepare, right? I prepare by writing the slides, by making notes in the slides, by forming an outline, thinking about what I want to cover. I'll go over the slides and sort of think, okay, on this one I want to do this. If it's been a while since I've looked at the talk, I'll go over the slides and sort of think, what was the key point in this slide, so that when the slide comes up, I immediately remember what it was that was going to happen on that slide. That's what I mean by come prepared. Like, actually go over your material, be very familiar with your material. Chances are, if you're giving a tech talk, you are the expert in the room on that topic, or you're one of the experts, right? So you're obviously well versed in the technology. Just make sure that you're versed, A, in the technology, and B, in the way that you're describing the technology. Don't carefully script all the words you're going to use to describe that, but do think about the general terms, the general ways that you want to describe this stuff. That's come prepared enough, just enough. Don't over-rehearse. Jokes, we talked about that. Like, in general, like, as much as I do these comedy talks and these satire talks, yes, I script jokes into those, absolutely, because that's comedy. I don't script jokes into my technical talks. I will try to make a joke on the fly. I will try to make it amusing if I can. And the more I do this, the more I have some sense of what will or will not work in the room. But I don't script jokes into talk because, most importantly, that's not the point of the talk, right? I'm not there to make people laugh. I'm there to actually educate people on the topic. If I can make it amusing, great, because it helps engage them. But I'm not going to waste their time by just making jokes. Those don't have a purpose. More importantly, I don't actually know whether the jokes are going to work until I'm in the room. And if you carefully script a joke, like, oh, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to say that, and then it's going to land, and then pause for effect, and the audience is like, and then it gets super awkward, right? I was at a talk years ago, and the person did that. Like, I think the advisor to them said, okay, well, start off your talk with a joke about, the technology or whatever. And so they did this, like, carefully scripted, choreographed thing, and then they said this, and you could see, like, in the speaker notes, it clearly said, pause for laughter. And they paused for crickets. And then the sweat just started to pop out on their head. They were so nervous because it had just failed. Like, not only do you not know whether the joke is going to land, but what are you going to do if it doesn't? Like, you're placing a lot of emotional impact, a lot of emotional baggage and import on this thing that may not land, and then what? Right? So yeah, I'll try to make amusing things, and if nobody in the room gets it, that's totally fine. I'm not really vested in that. That's not why I'm there, right? So you say the thing and then you move on. But in general, probably say the technical thing and leave the jokes for the actual stand-up comics. Practice, as I said, that's the prepare enough. Rehearse enough. So this comes back to, I think the next slide is about data. Yeah. Okay, so I don't rehearse, but I do go over my material a lot, and I'm ready to give it there. And I came up with this completely fake data to represent this difference. I would definitely not say that like my approach is the best. I know people that rehearse, like they script their talks and they rehearse their talks to death, and they give excellent technical talks. It's a totally valid approach to giving a technical talk. This is not my actual job, so I do not have the time for that, right? So my petty rationalization is that I don't have the time, and that results in no rehearsals because I would really rather spend that time, managing the team, writing the product, whatever. And rehearsals are for people whose actual job it is to give these kind of talks. But at the same time, I feel like the talks work in general because I'm prepared enough. But this is the fake data that represents the difference here. Is that I think if you carefully script what you're going to say, and then you rehearse it a bunch, and then you say that thing, I think for very many times you rehearse, it's going to actually suck way more than if you just made it up on the spot, right? Because you're going to be trying to remember that thing that you were going to say, what was the way I was going to phrase that, or you get halfway into a sentence and then that wasn't the way I wanted to say that thing, and then you go back to the sentence, and then you get lost and like, where was I in the paragraph, or you put it in the speaker notes. Like, there's so many ways that can go wrong that it's just going to suck more than if you didn't script and rehearse at all. And then eventually you start to get better because you've said these things enough, and now there's more of a natural flow. And then sometime up toward infinity, you've done it so many times, and this is stand-up comedy to a T. They've rehearsed that thing so many times that it comes off as unrehearsed. That's really where you need to get to. So you're not coming across as the person who is able to speak to the scripts in their head, but instead you're able to come as the person that can speak improvisationally off the top of their head, like they're just making it up, even though they didn't, right? So that's the trick, is if you want to rehearse, great, but rehearse enough. Rehearse it to death so that it no longer sounds rehearsed. My approach is this instead, where we'll come out and we'll give the talk for the first time, and it'll be a lot better than a rehearsed talk, but it won't be as good as the people that rehearse theirs to death before they give it to the first time. And then every time we give the talk, we get more and more familiar with the material, and it does get better. It would be great if I had time to actually spend on giving these talks over and over again. They would get better over time. I don't have that time, so I'm happy sort of, I'll start out at 60% and just kind of incrementally go up 1 or 2 times, and that's about as much as I ever give any talk, and then I move on to the next topic. But do know your content completely. So be very familiar with everything you're going to say in there, especially the complicated stuff in there. If you have a code snippet that you want to explain, make sure that you actually know what that code does and that you can explain it very clearly on the slide. Code can get very dense very quickly, and it's really hard for the audience to look at a page full of code and understand what's going on. So you, as the speaker, have the job of helping them understand what's actually going on. So know all the really complicated bits very well. If an image comes up and you are going to use that image as a trigger point to talk about web services and performance on the network or something, like remember that. So it doesn't come up on slide and you're like, next slide, right? Sparse slides, I talked about this in the Terrible Tech Talk earlier. Put as little information on the slide as possible. The bullets are there for me, but they are only reminders of what I wanted to say. The less information I have on the slide, the faster the audience is going to quickly parse it and then get back to me. And the quicker I am going to parse it. If I have a paragraph of text in a bullet, and I get to that slide and look at this paragraph, I'm not going to be able to remember what it was I was going to say because that's too much information to pull in, right? If I have 2 words instead, I can immediately look at that, get a snapshot of what the idea was, and then go. Speaker notes, we already talked about that. Don't in general, or if you do, use them with very few words. Same idea, like there's something that you want to say that you don't really want on the slide because it's a, some sort of giveaway or it's too much information or whatever. Just put it as a note in the speaker notes, but 1, 2, 3 words max. Gradual reveals. So a lot of times there is complicated information. Code falls into this bucket. And also like several bullets that may be covering different pieces of information. So maybe you have several points you want to cover, but it's important that the audience doesn't get bogged down in point number 5 while you're still explaining point number 1. So in general, like if I have a bunch of bullets that I'm trying to go over, I'll reveal them one at a time so that they see that point and get back to me so that I can explain that point. And they're not reading point number 5 while I'm trying to get their attention back on point number 1. Code examples. It turns out, little known fact, the code on the slide does not have to compile, right? We're not building, we're not getting compiler errors here. We don't care. All we want is for the audience to understand the most important bits there. So I was explaining some demo in some, I don't know, animation talk or whatever, and I wanted to talk about like, well, we get the information in the layout before, and then we get the information in the layout after, and then we do the following thing with it. And there's a bunch of repeated concepts in here. I didn't need them to know everything that was going on in the UI. I just needed them to get the main information, right? So don't put it all there unless you really, really need it, in which case you're probably going to put it on several slides so that they can actually read the font size. But just show them the salient bits, right? OK, so I want to say, OK, it's important to call begin delayed transition before you do all this stuff. And then we're going to set layout params. And it doesn't matter. All the details of what we're actually setting those to don't matter at all. It was the concept, right? So yeah, I can put ellipses in my slides because there's no errors on this compiler, right? Simplify the text. So sometimes there's a lot of information that doesn't need to be there. So in particular, people, like we're all raised with really good grammar and punctuation skills, totally irrelevant in slides. I'm not saying a period is a lot of information, but it's pointless information. Wait, is a period pointless? No, period is exactly a point. OK, on to my other point. You do not need a period there. That's kind of noise on the slide. Maybe it makes sense in some situations, sure. But I will work really hard to get everything off the slide that doesn't absolutely need to be here. So instead of all this information there, we could simplify things by A, removing the bullets. Why was that noise there? Sometimes it helps because it's hard to separate things. OK, that's fine. But usually line spacing can solve that issue. You can also abbreviate very, very heavily. Again, just like the code doesn't need to compile, these don't need to be complete sentences. Certainly not paragraphs, right? So first point, it's a reminder to you. It's not a grammatically correct sentence to the audience. Second point, third point, and maybe it's up to you to remember that subpoint in there. Like, do we actually need all the information? Isn't that why the speaker is there? Images are good to use. Sometimes just to break up the monotony of slide, 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 slide. And this is kind of a big push lately, but they get to be a bit much, especially when they're like completely disjoint images and you're not quite sure why they're there. I love this. This construction site had the most productive workers in all of Antwerp. Nobody could go to the bathroom all day long. Yeah, nice. Hearst, Texas, yay. Mind the step, London, great. Drive-through insurance, because they have drive-through beer stands. But just like, I will use them as breaks between sections, but I won't use them all the time. Like you get these templates developed by maybe marketing folks or people with much more visual sense. Well, we're giving technical talks for the most part. Maybe we don't need like that many visuals. Maybe I don't need a picture of an insurance stand to describe the concepts of Android animations. Maybe, just a thought. Don't worry so much. So one of the key things I think that makes a talk work, that helps really engage the audience and helps the audience have fun, is to know that the speaker is actually having fun, right? I really enjoy the presentations that I'm giving. I have a good time up here. I have a good time talking about the stuff. talking to audiences, engaging with audiences. There's an adrenaline that comes from being on stage that I don't get anywhere else. I used to do piano recitals as a kid. And I think this is why I do speaking, because I got used to that feeling of like the adrenaline of being on stage and everybody's looking at you. But the advantage of speaking is your hands can get clammy and sweaty and you won't screw up the piece, right? You can just keep speaking. Piano recitals, not so much. So the important point, though, is that the comfort of the speaker, I believe, comes from the confidence of the speaker. Like, I'm obviously comfortable up here, or at least it should look that way to the audience. You can't see my legs shaking. But that confidence just comes from having done it over time. So the best way to get that confidence is by practice. And the main knowledge that confidence comes from is that, well, I gave a talk and I didn't die. Like, what's the worst that could happen? You could die. Well, go up and give a talk and see if that happens. And if it does, then you don't have to worry about it anymore. And if it doesn't, well, maybe I won't die if I give another one. Like, what's the big deal? Like, I could say, in the middle of that sentence. Yeah, you could. I could forget the point that I wanted to make there on slide 37. Absolutely. Is that a big deal? I don't think so, right? The main thing is to cover the information in general and to keep the audience engaged so that they get all or at least most of the points that you wanted to make. So don't worry so much. It's not that big a deal, right? You're giving them information. Hopefully they're enjoying it. Hopefully they're learning from it. And if all went well, you didn't die. And have fun. And then the more confident you get, the more you can actually start to enjoy the experience. And then the audience has fun. Who's been to a stand-up comedian where the comedian's bombing on stage and the audience is having a worse time than the comedian? Right? Because the audience, the comic is like really uncomfortable, and then they get kind of angry at the audience, and the audience is just cringing like, I want to leave right now. I don't want to be part of this experience. But if you see a comic whose jokes fail, and they're fine with it, and they're just going to hang out there and try a few more and see if something works, that's totally fine. The comic is having fun. I'm comfortable being in the room with that comic, even though they may not be making the audience laugh. It's the comic that gets really insecure and starts having a horrible time that you don't really want a shared experience with. And it's the same with speakers. Like, if somebody is obviously really nervous and uncomfortable there, you as an audience member, you may not be learning as much because, maybe their flow isn't conducive to you learning the information. But also, it's just kind of awkward for everybody involved. So try really hard to actually enjoy the thing. I know you get nervous up here. I get nervous up here. I've done this tons of times. I still get nervous up here. Just try to misinterpret that as positive energy. That's the trick. Rule number 4. These are guidelines, not laws. And more importantly, they're guidelines that work for me. There are personal styles in presentations. I don't script. I don't rehearse. Other excellent presenters do. And they do fantastic presentations. So consider these as possibilities, not as rules and laws. And again, it's not a big deal. And also, always wear the same shirt. So if we can summarize all of that information, I have no idea whether I've gone over here. No, I think we're good. We're on time. Reduce the clutter on your slides. The more information you put on the slides, the less they're listening to you, and the less they're getting from the presentation overall. Engage the audience overall. Be a part of the experience in the room, not just some speaker in the corner that is output only to the room, right? That's not engaging for anybody. We do have time for questions and answers. So before I did this about 2 years ago, I wrote an article on Medium, which was way too long. It's funny, Medium gives you the great stats on how many people went to your article and how many people actually read the article. This article, by far, of all my stuff on Medium, got the least number of views, or the lowest percentage of people that made it through to the end because it's so long. But it has similar information that was going through my mind a couple of years ago, partly in response to a conference that I'd just been through and sort of dealing with what the organizers thought I should be doing instead of what I was actually doing. So if you want more on this, I go way into depth on that article. And in the meantime, I'm happy to take questions. More importantly, as I said, these are my ideas, but I'm actually happy to have a discussion about it. Like, I think there are a lot of other ideas that are totally valid and worth talking about. Yes?
I just had a question that's very specific to my style of speaking.
I'm not really handling those today. So. Yes. Yes.
No, that was it.
So no question, really?
No.
Oh, okay. All right. You just want to lob me a softball. Thanks. Thanks. Yes?
Do you have any comment when you have a question that doesn't make any sense, like somebody says, how do you work with the Oracle Firebase or something like that? What should you respond?
Yeah, it can be tricky. There can also be language issues or just understanding the acoustics in a room can make it really hard sometimes. If you can't easily get them to repeat the question in a way or rephrase it, then you may do something like, you know what, if I could follow up with you afterwards, you could just sort of take it offline. It's also good, if you think you may have understood, it's always good to rephrase the question. One is because you may be being recorded and they didn't speak the question into a mic, and therefore, like your question, I should have repeated it, right? And I didn't. Obviously, I don't know what I'm doing. So it's good for the mics and the recordings to repeat the question, but also it allows you to condense their question. A lot of times, it's not just a question. Yeah, I wanted to talk about the fact that the performance is not really as good on this particular release, on this certain set of devices, blah, 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 question, right? And what you want to do is eliminate the soapbox stuff and just get to the core question there. Yeah, so what I heard what you asking about was, why is the performance on so-and-so not as good when you're doing the following thing, right? And now, not only have I eliminated all the cruft and made it easier to understand the question, but I've also given them a chance to correct me if I've misunderstood it, right? So you always should try to rephrase and condense, and then that's a way to see whether you can iterate toward the actual thing they were trying to ask as well. Yes?
How do you tell, we have very passionate developers who speak at our events, but they actually are kind of bad at presenting. How do you communicate to them, and what would you tell them? Hey, how do you get better, or go get better?
So the question was, if someone, what's the term, sucks. Okay, so if someone is really excited about giving a talk, but they don't necessarily have the skills, first of all, the way to get the skills is by giving the talk. It's the catch-22, right? You will not get better if you're never given the opportunity to present. I encourage people, okay, so there's a couple of things is what do you do? If they're coming to you saying, I want to do this, how do you advise them? Or do you accept them into your thing? The other question is how do you actually help them get better? I advise people to start in smaller venues, hopping up on the main stage at Google I/O, probably not a good way to start your speaking experience, right? But there are user groups in the area, including the user groups that you run. Maybe there's a focused group, oh, you know what, we're having a smaller meetup for that focused technology on so-and-so, and then it's not as intimidating to them, so that maybe nervousness is not going to be as much of an issue for a new speaker, and yet they get a speaking experience. And B, you're not taking the larger group's time by someone that needs a little bit of training before they can get there. The same difficulty comes up in one of the reasons that I say don't put jokes in your presentation, because if you're not a comedian, it probably won't work. Honestly, it probably won't work because that's not our job, right? Those people think really carefully about all those carefully crafted things. Well, it's hard to tell people, yeah, you're not funny. Well, none of us are funny, right? So how can you generalize it to be a thing all of us go through this? It's not that that person you're dealing with is not good at speaking. It's that that person doesn't have the same experience that the rest of your speakers do. So how can you help to get them there? Right? Yes?
I think a couple points.
Yeah.
I think that giving people a practice partner if they're a first-time speaker is is one good thing. And the other thing is if it's a really big event, you can ask them to present a pitch to you and read out the
Balancing passion with speaking with them.
Yeah. But actually the original point I wanted to make was around that there's a lot of power in asking people to in repeating the question as a speaker. So I'm from Boston. I'm a new GPG, by the way. Hello. I'm a software engineer based in Boston, and when I give tech talks, repeating the question actually gives me sifting time. It gives my brain time to kind of not only digest but just kind of think of my answer. So you're you're synthesizing it as well and summarizing it. So there's a lot of power and benefit.
Yep. So the question didn't exist, actually. But you did remind me, though. Okay, so let's go back to what I said about rehearsal. And I don't believe in scripting and rehearsing. A new speaker, absolutely. Think carefully about what you want to say. Don't necessarily, the thing to try to avoid is getting locked into the idea that these are the sentences that I have to say, and then they'll be so worried about remembering the script that won't be any fun for anybody. But you do actually want them to go much more carefully over the material and think about what they would say and practice that a lot, right? And then also give that, as you said, with a practice partner, I forget what you said, where they give it to colleagues, right? And actually make them stand up in the room and give it more formally and sort of get some of that nervous energy experience of giving it more publicly, because that then also builds in some of the experience that they need to just get better into. Yes?
Do you have any suggestions so there's a side of where you have a speaker, obviously, that can use some improvement. What about when you have an audience that it's just really difficult to connect with? I found that sometimes where it's like you have an audience that's just this completely deadpan.
Right.
Any suggestions?
So what do you do about anger? Yeah, take it out on them. Interesting. I've given a lot of talks in Europe where the audience tends to be much more reserved. And I just sort of take that as read. Like, okay, that's fine. You're going to be quiet there, super comfortable chairs up there. You may be sleeping, but I still have stuff to say here, and I'll just go on. Like, you have to, this is part of what comes from confidence, is knowing that, this is good material anyway that you could learn from. I assume that they are learning from, and I assume that quietness or reservedness is from, language barrier or culture barrier, and that's totally fine. Or are you talking about actually a spitting angry audience?
No, not spitting so much, but what you described. Because I found even in the U.S. where it's like I've given the same talk at multiple groups, and one group you can engage with really easily, and the other one will just sit there in their deadpan.
Right. Yeah, and like the tricks for engagement that I have, like they don't necessarily work as well. But like honestly, it's not like I'm going out in the audience. I saw this happen actually in Antwerp. There was a speaker that had obviously been given the recommendation you should engage the audience, and he took this to mean as, I'm going to go out in the audience with a mic and say, "Hi, sir, what's your name?" And he stuck the mic in their face to this person that really didn't want to talk. And it was really awkward for everybody. And he went with it, man. He was all in. He did it several times in the talk. He shouldn't have done that, right? Like, let them live in their space. That's fine. Like, I engage the audience, but it's really kind of one way. I'm not, talking about my, experience with the speechless folks in a way that needs interaction from you. I hope you enjoy that story, and I hope that that's part of an ongoing conversation that we're having, but it's not like I'm waiting for you to respond. It's like, here's a thing, and then I go on with my technical talk, and if we have Q&A, that's great. And if everybody is really quiet and they want to go have lunch instead, then that's totally fine. Like, I think you have to be fairly happy with your own content and not, depend on that engagement or that interaction with the audience. I think audiences will be different. And then anger. Yep. So one point of order here. The food is actually out there, and I'm happy to continue discussing with anybody who wants to do that. Can people bring food back in here?
It's out there.
Out there.
Yep.
Okay, so if you're hungry, go eat. If you want to hang out here, I will too. And you can go eat whatever. Thanks.